Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the World Affairs Council of Orange County Board of Trustees and also Executive Board, I wish to thank all of you for joining us. We have participants from many of the states all over the US, so it's exciting to be able to share knowledge about the current development in Brazil. As some of you may have heard the past couple of weeks, there's been quite a bit of news about Brazil and what's going on with the political officials. And we were very fortunate to have been able to connect with one of the most knowledgeable, at least in our opinion, individuals about Brazil, Dr. Marshall Iken, who will be introduced by Dr. Longley, our program committee member, and he will be the moderator for the event. Toward the end of the program, we will be going toward the Q&A that will be coming from our audience. If you be kindly submit your questions on chat, we would appreciate that. They will be sorted out and also addressed accordingly. We do like to thank you to help and support us. Our programs are being offered for free, which used to be basically the only source of income we had besides membership. So we appreciate if those who are interested for us to be able to continue these programs to support us. We really appreciate that. If any of you have specific questions that are not going to be addressed today due to the time limitation, please do submit them. We will collect them and perhaps at the future time, and Dr. Ikens will be kind enough to address those and will forward them to via email. With that, again, I wish to welcome all of you. Thank you for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Longley, who will be introducing our distinguished guest today. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora, for that introduction. And we really appreciate everyone attending today. This is a great opportunity that came up really at the last moment. And we're especially appreciative of Dr. Iken taking time out of his very busy schedule when really we just put this together in the last couple of weeks. So definitely appreciate it. But let me introduce my longtime friend, fellow Texan, and even has a good California tie for us. So Dr. Marshall Iken is the professor of history at Vanderbilt University. Born and raised in Texas. Like I said, we have a natural infinity as a result. Grew up in the Houston area in the 1960s. After spending a summer doing public health work in Guatemala in 1970, he went off to the University of Kansas, where he majored in history and anthropology with a focus on Latin America. If you know, Kansas has one of the top Latin American programs in the country, ironically in the middle of the country, but we were very happy that we have that great of a program. He spent 3 semesters as an undergraduate and attended the University of Costa Rica, a place dear to my heart, and that's where he met his wife. In the late 70s, he did his doctoral work at UCLA, go Bruins, and began to specialize in Brazilian history. After teaching 2 years at Loyola Marymount in Los Angeles, he moved to Vanderbilt University in 1983, where he has been since. He has published 5 books, as well as 4 edited works, the most recent being Becoming Brazilian, Race and National Identity in the 20th Century Brazil in 2017. His latest book is What is Latin American History? And it'll be published in September. He's doing a lot of different work in a lot of different areas, but again, we're very fortunate to have an expert on Brazil and discussing what's going on there today as one of the largest economies and largest populations in the world. That is undergoing some significant stresses right now. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Iken and just say once more, thank you. And those that do have questions, be sure to put those in the chat and we'll follow up on that. So welcome, Marshall.
Glad to be here. I'm going to put my share screen up here. All right, so first of all, I'm a historian, right? So I'm not a political scientist, I'm not an economist. Right. So what I'm going to do is talk to you about the current crisis in Brazil, but give you some perspective on it very quickly first. So just to make sure I have no idea what your knowledge is of Brazil, we're not talking about a small, insignificant place. This is the 5th largest country in the world in terms of land mass, 5th largest in population, more than 200 million people. It's the 4th largest democracy on the planet. And depending on who's counting, it's somewhere around the 8th, 9th, 10th largest economy in the world, right? So this is not a small place. And as I love to remind my friends who study Spanish-speaking regions of Latin America, 1 of every 3 Latin Americans is a Brazilian speaking Portuguese. A clever guy on Wall Street about 20 years ago came up with this idea of emerging markets and said that Brazil, Russia, India, and China were going to be these emerging markets in the early 20th century. It hasn't worked out so well for all of them. But these are called the BRICS. Okay, so Brazil is in that group of these, not at superpower stage, but certainly emerging. And again, this is a place of continental dimensions. This is just to give you a sort of sense of size. Amazonia, right? What is this ecological zone, which is vast, is nearly as large as the United States. And like the United States, Brazil, because it is so large, is incredibly diverse and regionalized. Like the United States, right, it has various regional cultures and foods, accents, right? In general, that blue area that's right off in the northeast, this is the area that settled first, sugar and slavery in the colonial period, large-scale importation of Africans who were enslaved. So the northeast of Brazil, especially the coastal region, is one of the oldest, most densely populated, and most Africanized sections of Brazil. The southeast, the sort of red zone down here, of Minas Gerais, Sao Paulo, and Rio de Janeiro, is the economic heartland and second most important population center of Brazil since the 18th century. First with gold mining, then with coffee production, and now the real bulk of industrial production in the last 50 years has been in Sao Paulo, Rio, and Minas Gerais. That yellow section to the far south is the very recently, over the last century, settled region of Brazil, which ethnically is whiter. It has the highest social indicators in Brazil, highest life expectancy, highest per capita income, best levels of schooling. The green area in the north is mainly Amazonia. Only about 7% of Brazil's population, despite the massive immigration of the last 4 decades. And that purple section in the middle, the center west of Brazil, the little yellow area is Brasilia. And the area, especially to the west of Brasilia in Goiás and Mato Grosso, has experienced an agricultural revolution over the last 50 years of massive agribusiness. And just to give you a few examples of why Brazil matters. Brazil is a major agro-exporting economy, as it has been for a long time. It is the world's first or second most important exporter of sugar, of coffee, of iron ore, soybeans, much to the dismay of American farmers, oranges and orange pulp, chicken and beef. JBS is the largest meat packing company in the world. Brazil is a major manufacturer of automobiles, especially exporting Fiat automobiles all over the world. A major textile producer, a huge iron and steel producer. Vale, right, is the largest iron mining company in the world. It has become a major manufacturer of medium-sized aircraft. I'm sure everyone listening to this has probably flown on an Embraer jet, right? These are those regional jets. When you fly and there's like 70 seats. There are only 2 companies in the world that produce these kinds of planes, Bombardier out of Canada, which is now merged with Airbus, and Embraer, which was merging with Boeing but is backed out. Petrobras, the Brazilian national oil company, is the 5th or 6th largest oil company in the world. A group of investors got together many years ago and consolidated their control of the beverage industry in Brazil and then bought up a Belgian brewer, right? Took control of that and then bought up Anheuser-Busch, right? Budweiser, right? That means they are the largest beer company, beverage company in the world. These same investors bought control of Heinz with Warren Buffett. They bought control of Burger King. So when you have a Whopper with Heinz ketchup on it and drink a Budweiser, it's an entirely Brazilian meal. Okay? Brazil has had elections since the 19th century for nearly 200 years. Most of those elections up until the post-1945 period involved a small percent of the population, from 1 to 5%. Right? Since the 1940s, right, Brazil has become a mass democracy with mass politics. For about 20 years, from 45 to 64, this was a period of mobilization of millions of people for the first time to participate in politics. In the midst of the Cold War, geopolitics, leftist uprisings in Latin America, the Brazilian military took control in 1964. This is the beginning of a wave of military coups in Latin America that will culminate with the Chilean military coup on September the 11th, 1973. In September of 1973, almost every country in Latin America is under military rule, except for Costa Rica, Colombia, and Venezuela, and a one-party democracy in Mexico. So Brazil is at the forefront of this. But I want to emphasize, this is rare in Brazilian history for the military to be directly running things. They're in power for nearly 2 decades. And it is a very slow process of moving back towards what's usually called redemocratization in the 1980s. By 1985, there is an indirectly elected civilian president. A Congress is elected that will construct a new constitution in 1988. And this new constitution institutes universal voting for everyone above the age of 16. So Brazil, over the last 30 years, has truly had mass politics and universal suffrage. After a rocky start in the late 80s and early 90s, Brazil settled down to what appeared to be an incredibly stable political process and fairly stable economic policies. 3 major political parties have dominated this period since the 1980s. The PSDB, which is a social democratic party, very much like social democratic parties in Europe, slightly to the left of center, and they elect Fernando Henrique Cardoso president twice in 1994 and 1998. The PT, the Workers' Party, is left of the PSDB. It's clearly aimed ideologically at the lower classes, and they elect Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva as president in 2002, and he's re-elected in 2006. Despite Lula's reputation of being this wild-eyed radical, he's an incredibly pragmatic person who spent his entire career as a labor union negotiator and leader. Right? So as much as Lula would not like to admit this, much of the economic policies that take place under Lula in his 8 years in power are a continuation of what's going on with Fernando Henrique Cardoso. So if you're a businessman, if you're an economist, by 2007-8, you can look around and say there's an incredible continuity in economic policies here. The Brazilian economy will boom dramatically between 2005 and 2010. At the very moment that most of the world between 2008 and 2010 goes into massive financial crisis, Brazil is booming, largely because of exporting commodities, especially iron ore and soybeans, meat packing products, especially to China. Right? So Brazil, while the United States is in massive financial distress in 2009 and 10, Brazil is booming. I was living in Rio in 2009 and 2010 and moving back and forth regularly between the U.S. and Brazil, and it was a striking contrast between the incredible economic problems in the U.S. and the booming economy of Brazil. But that economy begins to slow down in 2010 and 11, just as the moment that Lula, who cannot have more than 2 consecutive terms, steps aside, and he basically says, if you liked me, vote for my favorite candidate here, Dilma Rousseff. Rousseff has a Bulgarian father. She's from Minas Gerais. She had never run for political office in her life. Unlike Lula, the pragmatist, the labor negotiator, she is much more the ideologue who's never been engaged in electoral politics. She is elected in 2010 and then re-elected in a very close election in 2014. So the PT was in power from 2003 until Dilma, as we're going to see here in a second, is impeached in 2016. The PMDB, the Brazilian Democratic Movement Party, I would say has no ideology. Its ideology is unite yourself with some other political associate group that allows you access to power. With the PMDB candidate, right, for vice president, right, they basically forge an alliance with the PT. Michel Temer, who is the vice president, will become president when she is impeached in 2016 and has essentially a caretaker government. Now, something about Brazilian politics. Brazilian politics in some ways looks very much like the United States. It is a federalist system, but it is much more centralized than the United States. And there are really only 3 political units in Brazil. Municipalities, which is roughly what we think of as counties. All those municipalities together form states, and those states together form the nation. Right? So there is municipal, state, and federal authorities. But the federal government has much more centralized power than we do in the United States. Because Brazilian politics is so fractionalized, with more political parties than any other democracy in the world, no political party over the last 30 years has had a majority. What this means is what political scientists will call parliamentary presidentialism. In other words, the president will be elected, but has to forge coalitions like a prime minister to have a majority in the House and the Senate. So this parliamentary presidentialism forces presidents to constantly bargain and negotiate to distribute the patronage of the state, of the central government, to win allies. Brazilians have direct presidential elections, unlike us. They look at us and go, what's this electoral college thing? They vote electronically, right, and within hours have the results of a national election. Everybody across the country, from the backlands of the Amazon to downtown Sao Paulo, are voting electronically, and the results are in within hours. Their voting is obligatory, although the fine for not voting is very insignificant. And in the presidential elections post-1990, right, the percentage of people voting who are eligible is far above 80%, although this number has been dropping in recent elections to about 80%. Brazil is an incredibly racially mixed place, like the United States, but unlike the United States, they recognize this enormous mixture. Brazilians do not use the term race on the national censuses, they say color. There are basically three dominant categories in which you self-select when you respond to the census. About half of Brazilians check off white, a little bit under 8% check off black, and about 43% check off pardo, which can mean essentially any kind of mixture. Right? These categories are much more fluid than the United States. For a long time, the official policy of Brazil was, since we've had so much racial mixture, and since we have never had laws designating official segregation or discrimination, Brazil therefore is a racial democracy. There is no prejudice or discrimination. All Brazilians, with few exceptions, as we're going to see, recognize that Brazil does have prejudice and discrimination, that this is really a myth of racial democracy. And to give you a sense of class structure in Brazil, the Brazilian censuses since the 1960s have not used categories we would think of lower, middle, and upper. What they are actually using is A, B, C, D, and E, A being the top level. These are actually categories developed by advertising agencies in the 1940s and 1950s. But to give you a sense of what it means to be middle class in Brazil, these are fairly recent figures. Class E, the lowest class, right, the bottom of Brazilian society, is $280 a month income. Right? At the top, to be in the upper class in Brazil, you only need $2,800 a month income. $2,800 a month. Right? This would be a low middle class lifestyle in the United States. About a quarter of the Brazilian population is in the bottom two classes, about a quarter in the top, and about half in the middle. And this is something fairly recent. I'd love to show this picture. This is what happens under Lula between 2005 and 2010. One picture is worth 10,000 words. What you see in this is the standard pyramid of social classes in Brazil that has existed for decades and decades and decades, right? Suddenly becomes a diamond. More than 40 million people rise out of the lower classes into the middle. 40 million people. That means you have 40 million consumers that you didn't have before. This is largely accomplished not only through the economic growth of this period, but more and more people entering into the formal sector of jobs that gives them regular salaries and benefits. Right? This is a massive transformation. 40 million people is larger than most countries in Latin America. And despite the problems we're about to see with Brazil, this is still, I believe, right, is an enormously promising economic scenario once Brazil manages to get control again here. Because you have millions of people moving into middle-class consumer lifestyle, right, in which credit for the first time, right, is really widely available. Brazil has enormous infrastructural and transportation needs that are going to require enormous amounts of foreign investment. road building, power generation. Right? Brazil is one of the largest green economies in the world. Nearly 3/4 of Brazil's power comes from electrical power generation, hydroelectricity. Right? It has enormous possibilities in the age of digital revolution, and what you see in that demographic pyramid there, Brazil is moving from a very, very young population to a mature population, where that pyramid becomes more like a column. In other words, the vast majority of the population of Brazil is moving into their prime productive years. Now, part of what happened when Lula experiences this economic surge, Brazil, like many countries trying to step forward, goes out and bids on major international events. They get the bid for the 2014 World Cup, right, and the Summer Olympics in Rio in 2016. But as so often happens, right, these things become multi-billion-dollar projects, and by the time the World Cup takes place in 2014 and the Rio Olympics in 2016, Brazil is in the midst of not only an economic recession, but also a major political crisis. And that crisis emerges out of a corruption scandal that is referred to in general terms as the car wash. And this is because they're using a car wash, a lava jato, right, as a way to launder money. And this is the sort of first instance of when this corruption scandal starts to emerge. At its core, what this corruption scandal is politicians and state administrators siphoning off funds from Petrobras, which in this period is enormously wealthy. Right? They siphon off money from Petrobras, and the way in which they do this is by basically rigging contracts for major construction companies in Brazil. And there are enormous Brazilian construction companies that operate globally. They will sign these contracts, and the companies will kick back money to politicians. And this is in multi-million-dollar sizes, right? So what is taking place is a payoff scheme in which all political parties are involved. I want to emphasize this, all of them. It starts to slowly emerge in 2014 before the presidential election, and in fact, it's Dilma Rousseff that puts through the means to name what we would think of as sort of special prosecutors to make sure that this is investigated. It will explode in 2016 as these prosecutors begin to round up and arrest more and more prominent individuals. A figure who emerges out of this is one of these prosecutors, a judge in Brazil named Sergio Moro. He's in his 40s. He has these sort of powers as a special prosecutor to use plea bargaining. And so what you do is you start with the lowest level people, you squeeze them, and they then give up information on the next level. And by 2016, they have moved up the chain of command all the way to the highest level of politics in Brazil. What is astonishing here, in a society in which people have very little confidence in the legal system, in which powerful, wealthy people rarely go to jail, is Sergio Moro and his team of prosecutors start to put in jail and convict large numbers of people who are very powerful and prominent. At one point, the CEOs of all the major construction companies in Brazil are in jail. This is something unheard of. So it does momentarily seem to give Brazilians faith that the legal system is finally going to work and corruption is going to be addressed. By 2017, they have sentenced over 120 people and they've convicted another 175. In one of the more controversial moments of this, Moro goes after ex-president Luiz Inácio da Silva, Lula, and he is convicted on charges of using an apartment that is actually controlled by a construction company, and this is seen as favoritism. When Lula is not only convicted but put in a jail, a special jail, but in jail, he loses his ability to operate in politics and therefore cannot run for president in 2018, when he's expected to come back and run again. Right. Eventually, it turns out through leaks that Sergio Moro was actually consulting with judges in what would be described as very unethical behavior and giving them information on how they should proceed. This impeachment of Dilma in 2016 would never have taken place except for the politics of the moment that we're about to see. A very close election in 2014 returns her for a second term in power as the economy starts to get worse. This corruption scandal, as it blossoms, becomes a way to attack, ironically, her, right, and her government, even though, as we're going to see here in a second, everyone is involved. The major media in Brazil has long been anti-PT, right? And this is sort of a dominant theme in major network broadcasting. People begin to demonstrate in the streets, calling for her impeachment. This impeachment, again, would have never taken place except that the Speaker of the House, right, sets this process forward because Dilma refuses to protect him from the prosecutors. Right? Had she been willing to strike a deal with this corrupt Speaker of the House, Eduardo Cunha, he would have held off on the impeachment and never moved forward. But instead, they move forward an impeachment process on the obscure and bizarre notion that she had misrepresented the budget to the Congress. This is simply an excuse to turn on the president that they hate. The congressional committee that hears the impeachment proceedings first, when they vote by the majority to move the process forward in the full Congress, the majority of them are under investigation as part of the scandal. The full House will meet in what is nothing less than a circus, and many of the people voting to impeach her are under investigation for corruption. The Senate will take up the case, very much like the United States, and convict her. And so in late 2016, she is suspended from office, and her vice president, Michel Temer, takes over for the rest of her term. So Brazil in 2016 is a real mess, right? In the midst of trying to hold the Olympics, right? A contracting economy, very high levels of unemployment, large amounts of demonstrations and civil unrest for those who support Dilma and for those who are opposed to her. So political polarization intensifies. Essentially, do you support the PT and Lula or do you hate them? This is, you think of the political polarization we see in the United States recently and intensify this. And again, Lula is banned from running for president in 2018. But what you have in this election is the emergence, very much like in our own society, of what is generally called loosely populism, and the emergence of social media is a powerful force. And the person who is elected is Jair Messias Bolsanaro. Interestingly enough, his middle name is Messiah. When Bolsonaro is elected, he's in his early 60s. He's a retired army officer who resigned, shall we say, under a cloud of suspicion. He is not exactly the anti-politician he puts himself up to be, because he's been a congressman from Rio for nearly 20 years doing basically nothing. Right? He has been married 3 times, has multiple children. His older sons are in their 30s by the time he's elected president. He likes to compare himself with Donald Trump. He is conservative and right-wing by every sort of possible definition. Right? He says what he's going to do is move in and reduce economic intervention in the economy and be really tough on crime, and that he's the anti-corruption candidate. He looks back on the Brazilian military regime and says, this is something we should glorify. This is not something we should criticizing. That the problem with the Brazilian military was they didn't purge enough. They didn't kill enough people. They weren't tough enough. These are just a few of his statements. We talk about Donald Trump and what kind of statements he makes. He doesn't even come close to this. Right? In one exchange here, the second one, he refers to a newspaper reporter, a female newspaper reporter he doesn't like, and said, she's not even worth raping. She's very ugly. Right? So these are just some of, shall we say, his more notorious quotes. What you see is polarization even more acute than what we see in the United States over the last 5 to 6 years. In the election of 2018, Bolsonaro will get 55% of the vote. The PT candidate will get 44%, and Bolsonaro begins a 4-year presidential term in January of 2019. So he's a little more than halfway through his term. He turns to lots of military figures to be part of his government. His vice president is a general. Half of his cabinet are military officers. This is Bolsonaro on Inauguration Day in Brasilia with his 3rd wife. Like his wife, Bolsonaro is an evangelical Protestant. He converts about 20 years ago. And one of his staunchest areas of support, one of his most important coalitions, is the evangelical Protestant right in Brazil. He is against same-sex marriage, homosexuality, abortion, affirmative action, environmentalism. He is openly antagonistic to non-whites, especially Indians. Right? He basically says we should open up all these reservations, which are there by constitutional law, and we should allow outsiders to exploit these. Right? For about 20 years, Brazil had been moving towards types of affirmative action and quota systems and legislation addressing racial issues. He's rolled back nearly all of this. Right? And he basically says there is no racial problem in Brazil, there is no racism, we're all one people. He will name Sergio Moro as his attorney general, which enrages his opponents. And they basically say, look, it was clearly a deal. Moro gets rid of Lula as a candidate, and now he gets rewarded. From my point of view, part of Bolsonaro's problem is he's incompetent. Right? He's somebody who does not even grasp how he should run the government. So there's been essentially management chaos for the last 2 years. They're constantly hiring and firing cabinet ministers. He is very much celebrating the dictatorship. His older sons have all been very present on social media. Some of them have political positions. China is Brazil's biggest trade partner, and they constantly attack China. Like Donald Trump, they support Israel, and he loves to refer to himself as a tropical Trump. So where does public health come into this? The Brazilian Constitution of 1988 says health care is a constitutional right of every Brazilian. The Brazilians will set up a public health care system, the SUS. This is the biggest attempt in the history of the world to offer public health care on this scale. Right? The largest sort of completely public health care system that you can find anywhere are in European countries. Brazil dwarfs them in size. What you will see in the public health care system in Brazil is it's a lot like the United States. People who don't have resources go to the public health care system. People who do have resources buy private health care. It's the second largest private health care population in the world. So both of these operate side by side. For much of the public health care community outside of Brazil, they look at this public health care system as visionary and incredibly creative and innovative, coming up with very cheap and inefficient ways to address fundamental problems. They're at the forefront of dealing with HIV/AIDS in the 1980s and 1990s. They come up with all sorts of creative ways to keep people out of hospitals and emergency rooms through all sorts of very cheap clinics, to deal with all sorts of things like infant mortality. It's seen as a sort of visionary public health example. But if you poll Brazilians overwhelmingly are unhappy with their public health care system. Brazil also has a very sophisticated public health research sector that goes back many decades. The Instituto Oswaldo Cruz, Fiocruz in Rio de Janeiro, is something like our CDC. They have very sophisticated institutes in Sao Paulo to manufacture serums and vaccines. And I've actually had a little experience directly as I worked for 3 years in Rio in one of the largest slums in Rio, which are called favelas, on a public health project which brought together public health officials in Brazil, physicians here at Vanderbilt, working around the issue of tuberculosis. And for those of you who haven't been in Brazil, here it is. Rio in particular is a stunningly beautiful place. This is looking from behind the Christ statue, looking out at Sugarloaf. This is the Atlantic off to the right. This is Copacabana Beach on the left, Botafogo on the right. Off in the distance, right here at the very end of Ipanema Beach. This is Ipanema here. Leblon is the very end. The most expensive real estate in Brazil is right here. On this mountainside, on the Saddleback, just on the other side, is one of the largest slums in Rio. This is Ipanema Beach. Right here, we're about to look at the other side. This is Rocinha. This is 85 to 90,000 people. All of this construction is completely informal and has been put in place in the last 50 years. It looks down on some of the wealthiest real estate in Rio, and the Atlantic Ocean. This is dense population. This is a classic example of what you see in the major cities in Brazil. Millions of people living in improvised housing, right, in dense concentrations, which make it a prime spreading ground for infectious diseases, whether that's tuberculosis or COVID. COVID begins in Brazil about the same time as the United States. In February of 2020, the first cases are in Sao Paulo, and they're directly linked to people who've been moving back and forth between Italy and Brazil. The first death is in March of last year. By mid-March, the state of Sao Paulo declares a statewide quarantine, and by April, it has reached the farthest northern regions of Brazil and the Amazon on the border with Venezuela, and in fact, one of the worst places, one of the most deadly places for COVID is in Manaus in the heart of the Amazon. By May, the deaths have passed 10,000. By late May, 20,000. Things are so bad in Brazil that Trump actually halts air traffic between Brazil and the United States. And in fact, at this very moment, right before he does this, Bolsonaro comes to Miami and visits Trump at Mar-a-Lago. And interesting enough, the man standing over Trump's shoulder here, the press secretary for Bolsonaro, it turns out is positive for COVID. So on their return from Brazil in March of 2020, much of the entourage around Bolsonaro has COVID. Bolsonaro actually has it and is quarantined for a while. But the health crisis, from my point of view in Brazil, is largely a crisis of failure to lead and to manage. The initial minister of health, right, is under enormous pressure by Bolsonaro to play down the crisis. So what you see in Brazil over the last year is governors of states having to step up and try and do something. And the governor of the state of Sao Paulo is an opponent of Bolsonaro and his likely competitor in the next presidential election. So much of what Bolsonaro has been doing is what is trying to counter the governor of Sao Paulo. And very much like Trump, Bolsonaro touts hydroxychloroquine, even bigger than the United States. His polls continue to go down in 2020. He will fire his minister of health. He will replace him, and that minister of health will resign. And eventually, Bolsonaro will appoint a general to run the COVID campaign in Brazil. But basically, this is a failure to address and even try and do something about a major crisis. Right? Bolsonaro constantly downplays this. He initially refers to COVID as a fantasy created by the media. He then refers to it as a small flu. And when people ask him in April of 2020, don't you feel bad about all these people dying while you're running the country? And he says, so what? I'm sorry, but what do you want me to do? In the end, this is a failure to act. So what you start to get is the political polarization, much like the United States, starts to play out around the COVID epidemic. Those who support Bolsonaro downplaying COVID and the epidemic, those who are against Bolsonaro attacking him over the failure to do something. What Bolsonaro will constantly do is try and stoke his base. And to show you how inept he is, eventually his own attorney general will be forced to resign, right? And it's because the federal police, the equivalent of the FBI in Brazil, begins to move closer and closer to investigations to the businesses and operations of his sons. Moro will speak out on this, and he will be attacked by Bolsonaro's base. And Bolsonaro basically admits this is a political act. He replaces the attorney general to protect his own family. And so what you have increasingly are more and more demonstrations, more political polarization. And in the midst of this, what COVID is doing and what this political polarization is doing is reinforcing what is already incredibly high income inequalities and racial inequalities in Brazil. And in fact, the people that are most deeply affected by the disease and the dying are the millions of poor people in these densely packed neighborhoods. The GDP has been declining in Brazil dramatically over the last year and continues to decline despite the fact that some of the other countries that have been affected by COVID have started to see some sort of recovery. This has constantly led people to say that maybe what Bolsonaro is doing is moving towards a more authoritarian regime. This is downtown Sao Paulo, the Avenida Paulista. This gives you some sort of sense of how urbanized and densely populated Brazil is. As COVID spreads through Sao Paulo, much like the United States, the medical system is unable to cope with this. They even have to start building all of these emergency facilities. This is an emergency hospital built in one of the oldest soccer stadiums of Sao Paulo. The grave diggers can barely keep up with this. They're burying people by the hundreds and eventually by the thousands. Bolsonaro, in the midst of this, will continually appear in public, usually without a mask, usually downplaying the COVID epidemic and trying to meet in public with his allies. So what you have is like a public relations campaign by the government saying there's not a problem here. Just some brief things to finish here to show you the scale of this. But this shows you that everywhere in Brazil has been affected by this. One of the worst areas, statistically, one of the deadliest areas in Brazil is actually in the Amazon. For those who believe that warm weather is going to do something to help this, forget this. The Amazon, Manaus, which has really the worst impact here, is 85 degrees and 80% humidity year-round. But what you can see in this is how dramatically these numbers have gone up. Brazil is now experiencing more than 3,000 deaths per day, right? The highest it has been since the COVID epidemic started. It is completely off the charts, right? You can see the red lines are France and Great Britain, the waves they've gone through. But you can see that on a per capita basis, Brazil is off the charts, and this is largely because the epidemic is moving with very little to check it. Vaccinations in Brazil have barely gotten going, and they've been completely messed up by a lack of government efforts to seriously take vaccinations and to move on them. More recently, Bolsonaro has fired his defense minister. The heads of the armed forces, what would be essentially here the Joint Chiefs of Staff, resign in protest. He has a hard time getting another general to take his place. But what this is showing you is there are very sharp divisions within the armed forces over Bolsonaro's way of ruling. His foreign minister resigns at about the same time. And as I said, deaths have gone above 3,000 per day. Brazil is now the second deadliest place on the planet with more than 350,000 people dead, and the numbers rising dramatically. More than 13 million cases. India is not far behind, and depending on what happens here, India will probably ultimately pass Brazil. But there are over 1 billion people in India, right? So on a per capita basis, Brazil is drifting, right, with lack of leadership, an inability to address the fundamental problems of this crisis. I'm not going to predict the future. I'm a historian. We're bad about predicting the past. But the virus is going to intensify over the next few weeks and cause enormous havoc in Brazil. And it's going to be largely up to state and local officials to deal with this because the federal government has been absent. And when it hasn't been absent, it's been obstructive. The political polarization in Brazil will likely continue and be heightened, and they're still 2 years from the next set of elections. Because of these resignations, there's the possibility a constitutional crisis might be emerging as Bolsonaro attempts to assert greater and greater control. It is unclear whether he has support enough in the military to strengthen his powers, because these guys are resigning on him clearly because he's asked them to do things that they're refusing to do. So this is a failure of leadership. A failure of leadership, to summarize it all. So I'd be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Marshall, for that wonderful survey of what's been going on both recently and certainly historically in Brazil. I'm sure it feels very much like a tragedy to all of us that have listened to you here today. We've got a number of questions, many of which were submitted prior to your discussion, but a number of them, refer to, how stable is Brazil today politically, and a couple of subtopics there. What is the current status of Lula today, and is he in jail? Is he out? Is there a possibility of him returning and somehow leading some other opposition, or is the military waiting in the wing?
So for Lula, the Brazilians have this wonderful phrase. They have these wonderful ways of describing things. And when things end up in a mess, they say it ended up in pizza. Well, what's happened with the corruption scandal is it's ended up in pizza. And part of this, what you see is Bolsonaro has too many political friends who are affected by this. So most of the prosecutions have sort of been put on the back burner. The people who are involved have been put on the back burner or have resigned. And in Lula's case, those revelations that Sergio Moro and some of the people involved in this were consulting unethically with each other, the courts released Lula from jail and have now overturned his convictions, which means that Lula can run for president. And Lula looks pretty serious about wanting to run for president. Here, my editorializing about Lula. Lula's done a lot of great things for Brazil, especially for the masses of lower classes. But sometimes you have to step aside. Lula's in his mid-70s, although as we see in our own politics, that doesn't stop people from running for office, right? Lula is the right, and so rather than cultivating a new generation of politicians to come forward and be leaders, it looks highly likely that Lula will once again gear up to run for president, which means you could conceivably have a highly polarized election around, do you love or hate Lula, do you love or hate Bolsonaro? Right? I find it unlikely that the military will directly step in at any point. Right? The military will probably stay in the barracks, right? The real question is, who do they throw their weight behind, right, without taking office, right? So I mentioned that the Brazilian military have rarely run the country, but for a long, long time, they were the ultimate veto power in the background. If you did not have the support of the military, you did not stay in office. So what's the big question to me is, how divided is the military, right? And that's going to affect the balance of power of what they do, right? The military, the army, and the navy are like the United States. They're separate from the police. But in Brazil, there are a whole series of different types of police. And one of those series of police is called the military police, which were really bulked up during the dictatorship. So you have these military police, then you have the sort of local police, and then you have the guys who are on the street who are unarmed. Right? So there are a whole series of different types of police, and those at the highest level are completely militarized. These are the guys, we talk about militarizing the police in the United States. These are guys with armored vehicles, high-powered weapons, and these are usually the people on the front line first who move into high crime areas.
Understood. So unlike perhaps the session we had a week ago on Myanmar and the complete sort of separation and brainwashing of the military there, obviously, which is, delved that country into a civil war. The military in Brazil is still connected to the government. Yes, I mean it's not independent.
Well, no, it is independent. It's under civilian control, but it's under civilian control. So in this sense, this is one of the questions about when Bolsonaro appoints so many military officers to political positions in his cabinet, that you're politicizing the military, right? And traditionally, it's a little bit like the United States, right? Traditionally, we try and appoint somebody who's a civilian over the military, although that doesn't always happen, as we see, right? So in this sense, the military they have their own autonomy institutions, but they're under civilian control.
Understood. Got it. Thank you. One question relates to racial integration in Brazil that you referred to earlier, and it would appear that and maybe clarify for audience, Brazil doesn't quite have the issues with racial politics or identity type politics that we do here in the U.S., or is that still simmering below the surface?
All right, this is a huge topic that I just wrote a book on. I'll try and summarize it this way. And generally speaking, all generalizations are false, right? So historically, what happens in the United States is racial mixture takes place. But in the early 19th century, the racial lines harden. And what that means is that you're either black or white. There's no in between, even though visually people come in all colors, right? And up until the early 20th century, we even had categories in our census for people who were really racially mixed, mulatto, right? So historically what happens in the United States, it becomes a bipolar society where you're either black or you're white and there's no in between. And what that means is when slavery ends, you can use Jim Crow to separate people by race, right? And you can oppress them by their racial identity. Even if they're very light skinned, they're still black. Historically what happens, so we have a system where historically we use laws literally to segregate and discriminate, right, that are only begin to be dismantled in the 1960s. What Brazil has is a system that's much more fluid and nuanced, but still prejudiced and racist, right? What they have is a color spectrum, and people are incredibly sophisticated in how they will describe someone, but the worst category to be in is dark, because everybody knows if you're black, you must be poor, right? So in Brazil, there are not these legal ways. There's not state-sanctioned discrimination, segregation, and prejudice, but there's a very subtle and nuanced system of prejudice and discrimination. The Brazilians, when they are polled in the last 20 years, 90% of them will say, yes, there is prejudice and discrimination based on race in Brazil. And when you ask that same population, have you ever engaged in racist behavior, 90% of them will say no. So apparently, it's a country with race and racial prejudice and discrimination in which only 10% of the people do this, right? What's happened in the United States is we're becoming more like Brazil. As people dismantle legal discrimination and prejudice, right, it becomes more nuanced, right? Our reactions to people become more nuanced. And in fact, we start to have a system that is more of a spectrum. I grew up in the South in the 1950s and 1960s. There was no such thing as people who were brown or racially mixed. That didn't exist. My kids grew up in the South in the 1990s, and they would come home and have all sorts of color descriptions for people in their classes. That's Brazil. Right? So in this sense, Brazil and the United States are kind of converging in a system where you have a much broader color spectrum and where racism, discrimination, and prejudice are more nuanced and difficult to root out.
Thank you. Let's move maybe to the economic side a little bit. And there's a couple of questions that I'll melange together here in terms of the Brazil-China trade relationship. Maybe bring us up to speed on sort of how that sits today with some of the pushback against China's, modern day colonialism, so to speak, as well as its impact on the Amazonian rainforest.
So I'll make a sweeping statement. The American century is over in Latin America, probably the rest of the world too, right? And the Asian century has already begun, right? Up until the First World War in South America, the overwhelmingly most important trading partner of South America was Great Britain. By the 1930s, this is over. So since the 1930s, for almost 100 years, the United States is the most important trading partner of everybody in Latin America. Right? This is no longer true. Chile, Brazil, a whole series of countries in Latin America, China is their biggest trading partner. We're still a trading partner, but China has eclipsed us. And like China is doing in much of the world, you do this by extracting resources and selling people your products and by building infrastructure, dams, roads, you name it. So Brazil today, right, under Lula, much of that commodities boom, they were selling soybeans and iron ore to the Chinese. What they discovered, like everybody else, including us, is the Chinese didn't open their markets to Brazilian goods or Brazilian manufacturers. So Brazil basically consumes these Chinese exports and sends them raw materials, right? And so like much of the rest of the world, they're unhappy with this. But the Chinese, as they've done in much of the rest of the world, look at South America and say, what are the strategic locations, including the Amazon, right, where we should have investments and we should build infrastructure. So this is why it's ironic that Bolsonaro attacks China. He's attacking his most important trading partner, right? His most important. When China stops buying U.S. soybeans under Trump, they fill that gap with Brazilian soybeans. Right? The Brazilians are happy to sell them soybeans. So it is a sort of strange relationship now that China has become increasingly important in Latin America, and especially in Brazil, yet the government of Brazil has this sort of very bizarre sort of knee-jerk reaction to criticizing the Chinese rather than trying to figure out how to get the best deal out of this.
Much of that is the sort of international trade rhetoric that we hear today, where, again, the leaders such as from Brazil will, bash a trading partner, but it's all sort of in the good name of playing to your domestic base, right?
Yeah, although it's not such of a domestic issue for most Brazilians. They don't care. Unlike the United States, where it is it's a strong sense of nationalism in the United States. And for most Brazilians, China is someplace out there. It's not that sort of ever-present sort of thing. And much of the bashing has taken place by his sons and his associates, right, rather than Bolsonaro himself. So it's sort of other parties.
Many of us are familiar with the South American debt crises, in the 70s and 80s. Can you give us a little picture of where Brazil sits today in terms of its, fiscal health relative to the outside world? Is it becoming owned by foreign debtors versus foreign creditors versus domestic?
One of the striking things, right, in the 1980s, when Brazil and lots of the world goes through this debt crisis, one of the ways to measure this is what percent this was of your GDP. It goes through the roof in the 1980s and early 1990s, right, in Brazil, right? So it's an enormous, a staggering debt. And then in the 1990s, as the Brazilian economy starts to grow again and they start to reduce debt, these numbers come down dramatically. So that between 2005 and 2010, when Lula's in office and this economic boom is taking place, Brazil's foreign debt as a percent of GDP is incredibly low. Brazil begins to contribute to things like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. Brazil becomes a creditor, right? But this has fallen apart in the last decade as the economy has contracted, right? Debt has gone back up. It's not as bad as it was in the 80s, right? The bigger problem in Brazil at the moment is the problem of unemployment. Right? Because the economy is in this constant contraction, you move back to this sort of society where you have large numbers of people who are underemployed in the informal sector. So all those good jobs that brought those millions of people into the middle class were jobs in the formal sector, in factories and stores. That's been reduced dramatically. And part of the problem of stopping COVID in Brazil is, like a lot of countries with large poor populations, these people live from day to day by selling things on the streets. So for them to stay home is not to eat. Right? So how do you do something about this massive informal sector on the streets where this is the way people survive?
Right. One last question. You'd mentioned the success, it appears, of the electronic and somewhat mandatory voting system in Brazil. How the heck do they pull that off? Is that truly the case, and does that hold a lesson for the U.S.?
It holds a lesson for the U.S. But we will never do this, right? Because our system is so completely decentralized. I have voted in 100 different ways in my life. I remember standing in somebody's garage in Los Angeles where they had little curtains they'd put up, and I was punching chads, right? Everybody does this differently, right? So I find it unlikely we'll ever even come close to this, right? But again, this is part of the centralism, right? It is a much more centralized system where they say, okay, everybody in the country is going to do this the same way, right? I would say, this is probably finishing on a depressing note, not only Brazil, but the United States and most of the world today, democracy is at a crisis, and it's a crisis of confidence. What you see, the United States went against this in the last election, but most of the world, voter participation is declining. Fewer and fewer people are voting because they are disillusioned after 20 to 30 years of voting in a place like Brazil or Peru or Chile or Mexico. People say, I've been doing this and I still don't like the results. Right? I don't like what's happening here. We see this in the United States for generations. It's an interesting question whether the next elections, what's the voter participation going to look like in the midterm elections versus this unbelievable turnout we just had in the 2020 elections, right? We went completely against the grain. We had the highest level of voter participation in decades, right? Most of the rest of the world, most of the democracies, especially in places like Latin America, voter participation is declining because of a disillusionment with the system.
Yeah, got it. Well, Marshall, that was a wonderful survey again on what's been happening in Brazil. And I want to thank, on behalf of the World Affairs Council of Orange County, I want to thank you and Kyle Longley for putting this together. We're at the end of our hour here, so we will close. Also, on behalf of the council, I want to thank all our attendees. We had 90 plus today on the webinar for attending it. And to remind you, it's very easy to donate to the World Affairs Council. There's a link in your chat box, as well as you can go to the website and please contribute whatever you're able to. We really appreciate it. We do have another webinar coming up on the Great Power Series on Thursday, and a number of others on the books for May. So again, thank you very much for all of you attending today, and we'll sign off. Thank you.